Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick, and as you can see, I'll be talking about the history of Magic's policy changes through the years. Couple of disclaimers before I get started. First of all, I'm going to be talking about policy changes, not rules changes. So if you're interested in how something in the rules has changed, or something with a game interaction, well, that would be a rules change and not a policy change. I did another presentation a couple of months ago where I talked about that, and you might be interested in checking that one out if you're interested in seeing how those things have changed throughout the years. And the other disclaimer is I'm not covering everything. Even just the heavy hitters is a pretty long presentation, so definitely don't be disappointed if one of your favorite policy changes is left out. I had to cut a bunch of really cool stuff, and it's really awesome to see the sort of stuff that Magic has gone through throughout the years. And I really wanted to make sure that I got enough stuff that gave everybody a flavor of that, but without bogging everybody down in too many details. That being said, if I did leave out something that you were really interested in, definitely leave a comment below so everyone else can see also. Alright, ready? Let's get started. So, in the beginning, in January of 1994, we had the Dci Tournament Rules that got released via a Usenet group. And if you're interested in this sort of thing, I would definitely recommend checking it out. Wizards of the Coast has it on their website still, what the original post said. I'm going to go ahead and pull out a few highlights that really kind of stood out to me when I was looking at it. So first of all, a referee may be required to interpret rules. So we were called referees at this time, not judges. To terminate an excessively long match. Boy, I wish I still had that superpower at sometimes some events nowadays. And to interpret a declaration of forfeiture, which we'll definitely be hearing more about those later, or to make any other adjudication as necessary during a tournament. And if you're wondering, a declaration of forfeiture is basically a more pleasant way of stating that if a player cheats, the referee will remove them from the tournament. And yes, this is the actual document, and this is the actual text that came right out of that document. Boy, I gotta say, this is a simpler time. But you have to remember where this stuff came from, right? Because Magic was the first trading card game to have a document of this sort, right? Like nowadays, you've got, a bunch of other trading card games, and if you were gonna write one of these sorts of rules and policy documents, you would just, look at one of theirs as a starting point and then base your own on that. And in fact, if you look at, for example, something like Flesh and Blood's rules and policy documents, you can see a pretty obvious influence from the Magic the Gathering ones. Back in here, we're the only game in town, so the people who wrote this had to basically start from scratch. And so they did an okay job with the task that they had, but it's definitely the case that there was a lot of stuff that was in there that could have benefited from some of the experience that we had now. But again, there wasn't people who had been judging for 10 plus years at the time when this document was written. Magic was only about a year old at this time. So, okay, you've got a declaration of forfeiture, which, nowadays we would call that a DQ. And here's another thing that kind of stuck out to me, which is that players receiving outside assistance, which today would be a match loss, would be getting one warning. And this is, I think, the only example of a penalty that was less stiff than the one that we have now. In the rest of this presentation, you'll sort of see a overarching theme that you can look for, where the penalties have gotten more and more loose, more and more lax over the years. And so this situation here, where the outside assistance first infraction would be a warning, well, that definitely also stood out to me. So, like I said, this is on the Wizards website. I'll leave a link to it in the description, and you can check it out at your leisure, but there's some real gems in here. Alright, now the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the formalization of this document, right? So that was literally off of a post in a Usenet group. So we had an actual document that Wizards wrote up, and they introduced it for the 1999 to 2000 tournament season. So this was an actual document that they had. Notice how long that we went before we even got to this point, though. So what did we see here? Well, there were rules for different formats that were spelled out. So this is where we had what it means to be vintage, and what it means to be legacy, and what it means to be standard. Well, actually, they didn't use those terms in that document. So vintage at this time referred to both what we would call vintage today and also what we would call legacy today. And that was type 1 and type 1.5 in the language of those documents. So there were definitely some naming convention changes, but you could still definitely identify what was coming out through this. Another thing that we had here was the first time that we really codified the general rules for a lot of different tournament procedures. So for example, what you had with mulligans, or like what the tournament match structure would look like, those were both written down formally for the first time in this document here. Okay, now let's talk about the DCI Universal Penalty Guidelines. And if you're wondering why they're universal, well, that would be because Magic was not the only game that used this document for its penalty guidelines. There were actually several different properties that were owned by Wizards of the Coast that were different card games, and even some tabletop games that all used the same universal penalty guidelines. So, for example, Pokemon was at this time a Wizards of the Coast property, as well as a bunch of other ones that were a lot less popular and turned out to have a lot less staying power. So that was one thing that was kind of interesting to me, was that there were sections of this document that didn't really apply to Magic in general. And it wouldn't be until sometime later that Magic would get its own dedicated document for these types of things. But this was the first penalty guidelines. In other words, the first codified example of what would happen when somebody did something that was against the rules. So we got an introduction of the different types of penalties that we could assess. Of these, only really the DQ, the caution, and the warning were referenced in the original Usenet post, but we see here that we introduced a game loss and a match loss as well. One thing I think is kind of interesting is that even though this happened 20 years ago, we still have the exact same 5 different types of penalties that we're using today. This is also the first mention of different rules enforcement levels. In this case, we had rules enforcement level 1 through 5, and those were different levels that you could enforce the rules at. So this is where we got the idea that Magic the Gathering has different types of tournaments, and people should have different expectations of how strictly people are going to adhere to the rules based on what kind of a tournament that you're in. So that was cool. So next, we are going to jump up to 2007, which is when we introduced the rules enforcement levels that we currently have today, which is regular, competitive, and professional. And those are still being used today. Now, I don't want to tell everybody that we didn't have anything going on during those like 7-ish years in between the previous slide and right now, but I will say that there wasn't a bunch of policy changes that was really important. Most of the updates for the policy documents would look something like we changed what cards are in standard, and maybe we banned something or unbanned something. Those aren't really updates that I'm going to be covering here. And then there were like some minor things where they would clean the language up a little bit. So it was actually pretty static throughout that time. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff, going on. And there will be, we'll see later on in the more modern era, there are going to be like some more riskier changes that they introduce. So let's see what some of those are in the future here. So the next one that I wanted to highlight was the play draw rule, which was actually introduced in April of 2012. And in certain premier tournament playoff matches, and it says exactly which ones that this would apply to in here, there's an alternate play draw rule. So in the top 8 for these types of tournaments, the player who has the higher ranking after the Swiss rounds gets to choose whether to play or draw first, instead of having a random method that was determining that. And if this sounds familiar, that's because we have this to this day, and it's gotten a lot more popular because they started doing it in basically all tournaments. And this is the first time that we had it, and you could see that there was only certain types of tournaments that you were able to use the modified play draw rule for. After that, later on in the same year, we introduced lapsing triggers. So the idea with lapsing triggers was if you had a triggered ability that you missed, what would you do? That was the question that we were trying to solve. And specifically, the thing that makes this a hard question is the fact that there's lots of different types of triggered abilities in Magic's history. And there are triggered abilities that are good and bad, and both of those got missed at reasonably approximately the same rate. But we definitely have a really different way that we would want to handle correcting those from a rules perspective, right? Because if you have a triggered ability that's good for you and you miss it, then, you know, we can be pretty sure that you didn't cheat by not gaining 5 life if a triggered ability is going to cause you to gain 5 life. So it doesn't feel right to make the penalty for that be the same as if we had a triggered ability where it was going to let the opponent gain 5 life. So even though those would both be triggered abilities, and if someone missed them, then they would both be a missed trigger, it doesn't really seem reasonable to have the same procedure for what you would do to fix it. So the idea with lapsing triggers was if you had a triggered ability that did something and there was a big long list of things that were lapsing triggers, if you had a triggered ability like that, then the opponent would be putting it on the stack at their discretion. So they would choose whether it got put on the stack. Other types of triggered abilities were considered separately, and they generally just resolved them, because the idea was if it's not something that's strictly beneficial, then we should just put it on the stack and make sure that happens. So then, like a few months later, no more lapsing triggers. So we came up with the innovation that we can handle all the triggers the same way, by letting the opponent decide whether they go on the stack or not. And then the judge is given the power to determine whether the trigger is detrimental to the person who missed it or not. And whether it is or not is going to depend, that's going to inform whether the person who forgot that trigger is going to get a warning or not. And so that was another really big step towards having more investigative powers for the judges, because the judge was going to have to use their own understanding of something to decide whether a penalty was or was not applied. And you couldn't just look at a list or look at a document somewhere and it would tell you the answer. You would have to actually determine that based on your own understanding of how stuff worked. And there were guidelines that got a little bit more developed as the years went by, for what types of triggers are generally considered detrimental and what types of triggers are not generally considered detrimental. But the move away from having a specific list and this is all the stuff that you are allowed to do and this is not, it's more of a theme throughout the whole years, throughout the whole history, that you're going to be seeing again and again. Is more faith in the judge to investigate and come up with a reasonable conclusion. So then the next year we had this change, dropping from an event. So players who drop during limited events own the cards that they correctly have in their possession at the time. And this includes any unopened or partially drafted boosters. So if you were playing back here, you probably have an idea of why this change was introduced. If you were not playing back at this time, this is about when Modern Masters came out. And specifically, I believe it was Modern Masters 2, where it was very possible to get a booster pack that had multiple $100 cards in it, taking into account the fact that there could be a mythic and a foil mythic in the same pack. And there were a lot of really heavy hitters in this set. And so it didn't really used to be a big problem, but now it was an actual hot button issue of what would be the correct person to give all of the cards to if somebody dropped from the event. If I just decide that I want to go home and like walk away from the table, obviously they can't stop me from doing that. But if I want to walk away from the table and take some Magic cards with me, well, it was a hot button issue because you had to make sure that the you weren't like taking away cards from somebody else. And especially if you opened a booster pack for the first, pack one, pick one of a draft, it's not really clear, that you should be getting all of the contents of this pack when throughout the normal course of a draft you would only be getting one and then another one after it tabled to you. And B, it's not immediately clear what would happen to the two other booster packs that are unopened that you haven't even looked at yet. And so they didn't go with my suggestion of giving those to the judge, but, this is, I guess, an okay compromise too. So there wasn't really a big, uproar from the player community about this. It was more so that, like, everybody was really happy that there was an official policy now that everybody could be on the same page. And were there some people who, got, hurt because an event that they were going to be doing with their friends got, it wasn't as fun as it could have been because they started out with only 7 people in a draft pod, or they started out with 6 people in a draft pod and it went down to 5. Well, yeah. But at the same time, the feel bads that would have happened from having to pass like a $50 to $100 card, that was also something that people didn't like. So I feel like this change was pretty well received. And then finally, in 2015, I actually had to like double or triple check this because I did not think that it was this long of an amount of time in between when the play draw rule was first seen at a competitive tournament and when it was made the norm for all finals brackets. But yeah, this is when that happened. Now, before this, there actually was an option where if you wanted to, the head judge could announce that they were going to be using this option before the start of the event. But, and this is back when PPTQs were a thing. So almost all PPTQs in my area were using this option. And they were, the issue was that if a judge forgot to make the announcement at the beginning of the day, then, technically you weren't supposed to. But pretty much every player in my area was expecting that this would be how it worked all the time. So a very popular change and, one that we still see to this day. And at the same time that they did that, they also had one other really big policy change, which was the penalty for failing to reveal a morph. Now, for years, let me give you some context for this. If there's a card that has the morph ability and you play it face down, then that's how it works. But here's the thing: if you play a card face down that doesn't have the morph ability, your opponent has no way of knowing that, right? Like, they have no way of knowing you didn't like actually have a morph card and play it face down. And the same thing would happen if you like returned it to your hand, right? If you had the morph card and it was returned to your hand, you were supposed to reveal it to your opponent to show that it had morph, so that they knew you were on the up and up. And the same thing would happen at the end of the game as well. If you, at the end of the game, if you controlled any face down creatures, you had to turn them face up to show your opponent that you didn't cheat and play something that didn't have morph as a face down 2/2. And so for a long time, the penalty, if you didn't reveal your morph, was a game loss. And that's what it was. It was a game loss. That's what it was when morph first got introduced back in Onslaught block. And that's what it was all the way up through when morph came back in Tarkir block. And the problem was that there was a lot more game losses than anybody remembered getting issued this way. And there was a lot of different like reasons that kind of got offered for why that increase was something that we saw. Like, for example, one of the articles that I read said that if you had like 100-ish person tournament, you would expect 1 or maybe 2 game losses statistically based on the like average rate that they happened at a 2,500 person GP, because that's about how many people was at a GP back in those days. You would expect to see about 20 or 30 people based on the same like percentage. And so you've got like a lot more physical people at events causing a lot more game losses. And then on top of that, you also had social media, which was much more prevalent than it was during the Onslaught era, being something that allowed people to share these bad experiences that they received with a lot of other people. And so therefore these problems were getting a lot more publicity. So the other issue, I think, would maybe be that there was a bounce spell in Tarkir block as like a common that was pretty playable, whereas they didn't really have that in Onslaught block either. So that some sort of combination of all of those made it so that there was a lot more game losses getting handed out for failure to reveal a morph. And so the Council of Judges thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And eventually we came up with, okay, it's not a game loss anymore, it's a warning. So they had an article where it explained their philosophy behind it, but the real reason why they did this is because there was way too many people getting game losses this way, and we wanted a way to make it so that it wasn't a game loss. Because if you think about it, the risk versus reward for cheating like this is not there at all, right? Like a 3-mana 2/2 is not worth it if you're trying to. There's not a lot of game states where that's a big enough payoff to risk getting DQ'd for cheating, because it would be pretty difficult to convince a judge that like you thought one of the cards in your hand had morph even though none of them did. Maybe if you played one and your hand had like another morph card in it, so you thought you were putting this one on the battlefield, but you didn't realize until too late that you actually put the other one on, maybe. But like a 3-mana 2/2 is not game breaking enough to risk. And if your opponent reminds you to check, or reminds you that you need to reveal it, which they're incentivized to because like they want to see what card you played, then the jig's up. Or if you have any number of things could go wrong where you could get found out. So the real straw that broke the camel's back was when people were gaming the system and not telling their opponent to reveal the morph, because they wanted to get their opponent getting a game loss because they forgot to reveal one. So you'd hear stories about like where people would like try to distract the other guy, so that they would forget to reveal their morph, and then they would call for a judge and get their free win. There's all kinds of stories about that floating around. So that was the real like straw that broke the camel's back. And okay, we really need to change this. We've got to figure something out. And so that's what we figured out. We figured out, okay, maybe it can be a warning. And it I don't think that anyone really got upset over that this change either. So then we had this one, sealed deck registration. And if you remember a couple of slides ago, this kind of fits in with that one. The one where we changed, we formalized what would happen if someone dropped from a limited tournament and what cards they actually were supposed to own. So with this change, we have, you get the cards that you opened back from the person across from after the person across from you registered. So let me explain this, give you a little context if you were not playing back in these days. For years, and I mean years, the way that sealed worked was you would open some cards and then people would be telling you up and down, like if it was your first sealed tournament, like during the announcements, during the like registration, people would tell you those aren't your cards. They belong to the guy that you're passing that pool to. And so that was how it worked. If you opened a really expensive chase rare, that was cool, but it wasn't, cool for you. It was cool for whoever you passed the sealed pool to. Because what would happen is you would register that pool that you opened, and then you'd pass it to someone else. And then someone else would be the person who actually played that pool and actually got to keep all those cards. And meanwhile, someone else would open your sealed pool and pass it to you, and then you would be the person who played those cards. And I don't know how it happened, but, I never got past a chase rare, but I passed plenty of them. And, if you ask any other Magic player, they're going to, say the same exact thing because of how confirmation bias works. But, that was very, very, like, that was a meme back in those days, was like, oh, look, looks like I opened someone else's, whatever X, card that people were trying to open back in those days was. So then they had that change that they made a couple of years ago, where if you drop from a sealed tournament, then it doesn't matter if, it doesn't matter if I'm supposed to be passing this sealed pool that has multiple chase rares in it to someone else, because I'm the person who correctly has all those cards in his possession right now, so they're all mine. And so that would lead to some situations where you drive 3 hours to a GP, and then you pay your $60 because that's how much limited GPs used to cost, and then you would open your sealed pool, and it would be like hundreds of dollars worth of Magic cards, because you could get that in like 2 cards back in Modern Masters 2, which is about when this came out. And then you'd have to make a really tough choice. You could either stay in the tournament and, actually get to play at the GP that you like traveled with all your friends to get to play, or you could take the money and drop from the tournament, and you would get to keep the sealed pool that you had opened, but at the same time, you would have to like find something else to do all day because you dropped from the main event. So obviously, neither one of those options was like super duper palatable, so it kind of put people in a really uncomfortable position. So now we have this new procedure that helps fix that issue. So now you're not going to be incentivized to drop if you open a bunch of expensive cards in your sealed pool, because the cards that you're opening are your cards now. So that was the reason why they made that change. And again, even though this objectively makes your day longer when you're in a sealed pool, because there's an extra step where you have to get the sealed pools back to the original player. And even though this objectively is a much harder logistical challenge than everybody passes their sealed pools like 3 people to the right, it still was a lot better for the players. And as judges, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make the player experience as good as we possibly can. And I have not heard one player try to claim that this change was a worsening of the player experience. So as a result, that's what we do. Like, because that's our job as judges. We want the player experience to be as good as we can. And even if that means more work for us or more complications for us, we'll do it because that's what we're here for. So that was this change here. And again, they announced this right before a certain high profile GP in Las Vegas where they were going to be running sealed with a Modern Masters set. So certainly a very timely thing. I think they might have actually changed it before a couple of other GPs, but I'm pretty sure that the GP in Vegas was the reason why they were super interested in doing this. All right, so now we get up to hidden card error, which happened in 2016. And if you remember before, what I was talking about the Morph, the penalty for the Morph not getting revealed was a game loss. And you remember the reason that it was a game loss was because it was very difficult for an opponent to detect that you had broken the rules in a case like that. Similarly, if you had extra cards in your hand, then it was also very difficult for an opponent to catch you having extra cards in your hand. Most of the time, you don't even know how many cards your opponent is supposed to have in their hand. And it's not like if someone sneaks an extra permanent onto the battlefield where you know how, like, what permanents are supposed to be on the battlefield. So if someone gets an extra one, it sticks out. No, it's like if someone has 5 cards in hand or 6, and I don't even know how many they're supposed to start out with, it would be very difficult to detect drawing an extra card. And so using that same sort of logic, the penalty for drawing extra cards for years was a game loss. And the idea was, again, that you had corrupted the game state in a way that was both very advantageous to you and very difficult for the opponent to detect. And so a harsher penalty was thought to be required. Now, with this, we had the potential to fix that. And the idea was this. What the rules and policy team had come up with was, if you allow the opponent of the person who has drawn extra cards to see that player's hand and then choose one of the cards in there that is going to be their vote for which card was the extra one. And then we shuffle that one away. Then we've removed the potential for advantage from committing this infraction, because the player who has extra cards in their hand is going to lose presumably their best card instead of a random one and instead of a one of their choice. And so yes, the game state is much different from what it would have been if there was no error, but we did it in such a way that the committing the infraction didn't lead to a long-term advantage for the player who did it. And so that was the idea behind drawing extra cards, turning into this new infraction, hidden card error. And we also rolled a couple of different types of infractions in with it, but that was basically the idea. And I want to point out here, this is not like a one-time thing, because over the next several policy updates following this one, the hidden card error had to get revised several times until we got to a point that satisfactorily incorporated all the different nuances that we needed it to without giving some sort of weird or counterintuitive results for some other types of situations. And if you were playing back then, or judging especially, I really feel bad for all the people who had to try to keep on top of this, because it was kind of rough, and you had to like kind of relearn everything every 3 months. But at the same time, I definitely think that we're in a way better spot with this now than we were previously. All right, so and then there's pile shuffling, and I personally don't think this was this big of a deal. But I know that there's probably a lot of people who would be talking about this one and asking why I didn't put it in there if I didn't put it in. So pile shuffling isn't sufficiently random, and it can't be performed more than once anytime a deck was being randomized. And they actually had to change this to you can only pile shuffle at the beginning of the game, because there were people who didn't like this rule, and they were pile shuffling with every like fetch land activation to make a point. So they actually had to change this a little bit afterwards, so there was like it wasn't once per randomization, it was once per game at the beginning of the game. But that was this change. Realistically, I don't think a whole lot changed. Not in tournament Magic anyway. Most tournament players were already following this rule. It was just like, some judges really don't like pile shuffling. They don't even like want to call it pile shuffling. They call it pile counting, because it's not technically randomizing the order, so it doesn't count as shuffling. Well, okay, that's fair, but like, let's be realistic here. The purpose of pile shuffling is kind of debatable, but at the same time, it's something a lot of people do. And if you remember what I was talking about before, as judges, our job isn't to tell people what they want. Our job is to figure out what people want and then help the tournament experience meet those expectations. So, all right, the next one that I wanted to talk about is decklist problem. And for years, that was what it was called. If you had a mismatch between what you registered in your deck list at the beginning of the day and what your contents of your deck was, that was a decklist problem, and it was a game loss. Now, at this point, when the rules and policy revision happened for this specific one, we split that into two different infractions. So now we have a deck problem and a decklist problem. And so if you registered 59 cards on your deck list, that would be a decklist problem. And even though your deck had 60 cards, you would have a deck list problem because your deck list did not have the correct number of cards. And that was distinct from if you had a deck problem where you had a legal deck list, but your deck had only like 59 cards, say. So those were now handled separately in two different types of infractions. And the reason for that is because while deck list problems were still generally a game loss, a deck problem now had a default penalty of a warning instead of a game loss. And so this allowed us to not have to give a lot of game losses that we otherwise would have under the previous policy. One of the most prominent examples of that would be failure to decideboard. And again, the idea was if the potential for abuse is not there, then there's no reason to make the penalty be a game loss. So even if I forgot to sideboard out my flash freezes against a player who happened to be green-red, if I call for a judge as soon as I see the first flash freeze, then there's no real way that I can profit from that mistake, right? And so with that being the case, it doesn't really make sense to have that one be a game loss when we could just fix the deck at that point and then keep playing. And so that was one of a number of different types of infractions that used to be a game loss, and now it's not. And so that sort of smoothed things out a lot as far as those types of issues were, because a lot of game losses now got turned into a warning. And then we've got this one here, which is bribery and improperly determining winner. So it turns out that both of these got changed. They used to be a DQ for years and years, but now they're match loss. But please don't do either of those, because if you do it intentionally, it's still cheating, and that's a DQ. So don't do it, okay? But this was, I remember this being like a pretty big deal, because for many years, you had to, like, if like some little kid rolls a die to decide who wins in F&M, then they were DQ'd. Or like if two people in like the nosebleed tables who are like nowhere near a winner, like, oh, you know, I'm dropping, oh no, I wanted to drop, here you can have it, oh well, let's just roll to see you have it. Like that, nobody was actually damaging the integrity of tournaments doing stuff like that. What we were actually doing was DQing a bunch of people who didn't know any better. And so this change here helped us not have to DQ as many people for that sort of thing. Honestly, I saw a lot of people get DQ'd because of, you know, not knowing any better. I don't think I've ever heard of, not even seen, just heard of a case where someone like seriously tried to bribe or seriously tried to randomly determine the winner through an outside the game method, because they were trying to disrupt the event integrity, rather than just, like, you know, not knowing that it was against the rules. So, oh, whoops. So this is another like really big feels bad that we were able to mitigate. And so that was the last like really big change that I would consider, like the most recent, like relatively significant ones. So I wanted to talk to close things out with a little bit of a discussion about some general trends that I observed during the course of this, and you know, hopefully, you know, brought to light here through the discussions. So we went from harsher penalties to looser penalties, and there were a lot of examples throughout this presentation of stuff that used to be a DQ and now it's not, or stuff that used to be a game loss and now it's a warning. And that is a big general trend that I have noticed, is we're trying to, it's actually nowadays very difficult to get a game loss in a game of Magic. You would have to, like, either really be trying for it or like be tardy, which, you know, for administrative reasons, I think we probably should keep that being a game loss. But a lot of the stuff that used to be a game loss, even since I started judging, is now a warning. So I think that's something that a lot of players like, especially a lot of judges like too, because, you know, we have hearts too. We don't like telling people that they got a game loss because they made what was obviously a mistake. But, like, you know, at the same time, like, sometimes that happens. Another is there's been a trend to more faith in judges to investigate and come to a reasonable conclusion. So I think in the very beginning, one of the, like, major philosophy points was that we cannot possibly allow a player to gain any advantage from a mistake that they made. Now the philosophy is a little bit different. It's more in line with, if a player does make a mistake, we want to mitigate the advantage that they get as much as possible, or as much as practical. And another thing is that, like, judges are more given more judgment. in a lot of cases. In the very beginning, it was very much like a black and white sort of thing. Like, you know, if the policy document says this, then that's what we're going to do. And we try to do that now, but there's more like cases where you can think about it. So it's more flexible that way. You don't have to like hope that Wizards never prints a card that makes your previous policy look stupid. And there certainly were a lot of cases like that. And then a lot of policy changes are driven by practical considerations. So what I mean by that was, if you look at the first policy document that we had, the one that I referenced very beginning, it's like maybe a page and a half long total. And it wasn't very comprehensive at all. And a lot of the filling in and making it more comprehensive came from stuff that happened at real tournaments. And a lot of the policies that have changed throughout the years changed because there was like a high profile example that happened at a big tournament that really highlighted the policy not doing what it was supposed to do. And so then we had to change it so that we had a policy that did what it was supposed to do. And so those are three of, I think, the general trends that I saw throughout the research that I was doing, and hopefully that kind of came through too. I guess maybe another thing that I want to talk about is we're definitely not done. In fact, like just talking to some of my colleagues when I was doing research for this presentation, we could come up with like a handful of things that we think could improve. The policy still changes every 3 months. And I think that we're working, the fact that we had to take some time off from in-person events from the COVID situation really kind of slowed that process down, but it's not like it stopped. And there still is some work to do in some areas. I won't like go into too much detail about that because, next year that might have fixed all of that stuff. And then I would look kind of dumb. But there certainly is stuff that we're still working on, and there still is stuff that is a work in progress, or maybe not the best possible version that I could conceive of. But we still are trying. So that is one of the things that I think has made Magic a great game, is that the tournament folks who are in charge of this sort of stuff really do care about having a good player experience, and we really do take feedback from other people into account. So if you have something that you're interested in, that you think is not a great policy, definitely leave some comments, and maybe someone who is in the powers that be will see it and fix it. But with that, there's one more general trend that I wanted to highlight, and that is my gratitude towards all of my patrons on Patreon for helping support this channel. I really do appreciate all of you, and I definitely want to make sure that everybody hears me say that every time, because it is true. Like I really do appreciate all the support that I get. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.